Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I will tell you about how the HOA organized a wedding on my farm. My close friend, let's call him Darius, had invited me to spend a few weeks at his countryside home after I had finished a grueling work project. I was worn out from endless conference calls, demanding clients, and the general stress of living in a busy part of the city. The moment my tires left the highway, winding down two-lane roads flanked by pastures and rolling hills, something inside me settled. This was the first time in my life when I genuinely felt connected to nature. When I woke up in the mornings to the sound of roosters crowing, I felt so alive. By the time I left Darius's place, my mind was set on saving up enough money to purchase a farm of my own one day. It might have seemed out of character to my coworkers and acquaintances back in town, but to me, it felt absolutely right. When I finally managed to buy my own piece of property a few years later, I was beyond excited. A slightly run-down two-story farmhouse stood in the middle of about 80 acres of fields and woodlands. The roof needed some work. The barn was missing a significant chunk of the rear wall, and the interior was filled with the oddest floral wallpaper you've ever seen. Still, I knew it had plenty of potential. I spent months renovating it, from sunrise to sunset on the weekends, and sometimes during the weekdays too, if I got off work early. The quiet was soothing. It felt good to sweat and labor over something that was truly mine. No city landlord, no building management, no constant bustle. This was the place I wanted to live, even if the dream took time to fully realize. Despite my property being somewhat rural, I eventually learned that there was still a local homeowners association. It was smaller than the HOAs that typically manage suburban neighborhoods, but it had some of the same unpleasant tendencies I'd heard about. When I first moved in, a neighbor from across the road, a man named Brock, came over with a loaf of bread to greet me. He was kind enough to fill me in on the fact that a handful of folks had banded together to form an HOA that governed a large section of properties on both sides of a winding country lane. The reason they existed at all, he explained, was because a small developer had once built a series of farmhouse-inspired homes near my area, and somewhere in that process, an HOA was established. Over time, it expanded its influence to older properties too. Even though not everyone had actually consented to it, Brock told me to watch out for them, specifically for a man we'll call Stanton, who acted like the boss of the HOA. I tried to keep an open mind. After all, not all homeowners associations are necessarily corrupt or meddlesome. Besides, my property was quite a bit larger than most in the region, and the farmhouse existed well before the smaller development was built. I assumed maybe the HOA would just leave me alone. Unfortunately, that was wishful thinking. Within my first 3 months of living there, I got a typed letter in my mailbox. The letter had official-looking letterhead, just the acronym of the HOA, but it was printed in bold and in fancy cursive. It demanded that I repaint my fence a more neutral color and replace my mailbox to match the standard. I found this all extremely odd because I didn't have a typical fence around my farmland. Most of my acreage was bordered by sturdy wire fencing for cattle, not the quaint decorative fences you might see in suburban neighborhoods. As for my mailbox, it was one of those standard rural mailboxes on a post at the driveway. There was nothing weird about it. I shrugged off the letter and decided to just ignore it, telling myself that maybe they had the wrong address. Weeks passed, and I found more letters in my mailbox, each progressively more threatening in tone. I was told I owed fines for various violations, including failing to remove debris from the property. The debris they were referring to was actually a pile of mulch and wood chips I'd had delivered for my flower beds. Refusing to submit a form for exterior decorations, they took issue with the old metal farm sculptures I had found at an antique sale and placed by the front porch, and neglecting to request approval for events. That final complaint especially perplexed me, because I rarely hosted large gatherings. The biggest event on my property at that time had been a tiny cookout with maybe 4 or 5 friends. All told, these letters were becoming a real nuisance. I had a strong suspicion that the guy behind all this was Stanton, the same man Brock had warned me about. Stanton was rumored to have a controlling streak. From what I heard, Stanton owned one of the more expensive modern houses in the area, but he claimed to be a champion of rural authenticity to fit in. Allegedly, Stanton had big plans for expansions and new construction in our part of the county, and many folks suspected his end goal was to create a gated community. Of course, a gated community in a farmland setting made no sense to me, but I'd learned that some people chase money and power without caring about logic. Stanton often liked to flash around the fact that he had connections at the local courthouse or city planning office, or so the rumors went. In short, if you lived within the radius of the HOA, you were expected to watch your step. For a while, I tried to handle everything politely. I responded to a couple of the letters in writing to state that I didn't believe their rules applied to me. My farmhouse was older, predating the HOA by decades. I also explained that my property was large enough and primarily agricultural, so it shouldn't be placed under the same rules as a newly constructed home in a planned subdivision. I never received a direct response to those letters, which irked me, but I decided to keep my head down. I was already busy with renovations and improvements. I had no interest in starting a feud if I could help it. Months rolled by and I'd mostly forgotten about the HOA nonsense, aside from the occasional exasperation at rummaging through envelopes claiming that I owed them late fees. Eventually, I decided it was time to take a much-needed vacation. I'd saved up for a trip that would take me and my girlfriend Rita across the country to visit some of the national parks. We planned to spend 2 weeks hiking, fishing, and enjoying the scenic routes in our small RV. My friend Darius, who'd gotten me hooked on the farm life in the first place, offered to swing by my place occasionally to ensure everything was in order. Between him and Brock, I figured I had enough folks keeping an eye out for suspicious activity. Besides, I'd done everything possible to secure my property, locking gates, double-checking all the doors. My biggest concern was that a storm might blow through and cause damage, but that was the extent of my worries. Little did I know that Stanton and his HOA crew had concocted a harebrained scheme while I was gone. Apparently, Stanton's daughter was engaged, and they were in need of a prime location to hold her wedding. From what I gathered after the fact, the original venue they'd booked had some sort of scheduling mishap, leaving them scrambling for a new spot at the last minute. Now, rather than searching for a willing venue or even renting some other location, Stanton got the idea that my farmland would be the perfect place. It was scenic, open, and presumably cost-free if they just pretended they had the authority to host the event there. He'd probably reasoned that I, as a member of their HOA, which I'd never really consented to, was obligated to cooperate or something ridiculous like that. The day of the wedding was, by all accounts, quite an event. They set up large tents on my front lawn, pitched canopies in the field where my cattle usually graze, and parked dozens, if not hundreds of cars along the gravel driveway and on the roadside. Stanton had apparently commissioned a small fleet of catering vehicles to serve a formal dinner. I heard from another neighbor, Willow, that there was a giant archway with fake flowers placed right in front of my wraparound porch, and all my potted plants had been moved to improve the aesthetic. I was incensed when I heard the details, but at that point, I was still hundreds of miles away. I learned about this fiasco when I got a phone call from Brock, who was absolutely agitated and trying to stay calm enough to speak. He started asking me if I had authorized a wedding ceremony on my property. I was confused at first, thinking he was joking. But when I pressed him, his voice trembled with anger. He told me he'd just driven past my farm and seen crowds of people, decorations, and music blaring. He was worried about potential property damage because a row of cars was parked along the edge of my orchard, and people were stomping around in fields that clearly had no trespassing signs posted. Brock also told me that the wedding was well underway, with a minister officiating by that large white arch. My jaw nearly hit the floor. I told Brock in no uncertain terms that this was definitely not authorized by me. I was livid. My girlfriend Rita overheard everything and started frantically asking what was happening. I repeated what Brock had said, and her eyes went wide with shock. She immediately grabbed her phone to start looking up local law enforcement numbers. Brock and I agreed that we needed to call the police on this. We had no clue how large the wedding party was, nor did we know if things would escalate into vandalism or theft. But we knew enough to see that a group of uninvited people were trespassing on my farm, claiming it as their wedding venue. It took me all of 5 seconds to get on the phone with the local police. I had to explain calmly, I am the owner of the farmland at this address. I'm currently out of town, but I've been informed that there's a large gathering on my property that I did not authorize. They appear to have set up a wedding. Yes, a wedding. I do not know these people personally, but I strongly suspect it is the local homeowners association or individuals involved with them who are illegally using my land. The officer on the other end sounded stunned, but he assured me he'd dispatch a unit as soon as possible. He also advised me to stay on the line and remain available if additional questions arose. In the meantime, Brock and my friend Darius, who both lived fairly close, decided to drive back to my farm to act as my eyes on the ground. As soon as they arrived, they took photos and videos from a respectful distance so as not to get themselves entangled in any confrontation. Darius told me that it was downright surreal. Guests in fancy dresses and tuxedos roamed around sipping champagne. An entire buffet line was set up inside a large tent near my barn, and the wedding photographer was bossing people around to capture staged moments. At one point, Darius even saw kids playing around with the locks on the barn door. He was worried someone might force it open and cause damage inside. Meanwhile, Stanton was apparently strutting around, chest puffed out, greeting guests and showing off what he likely advertised as his own countryside estate. It was the kind of gall I'd only seen in movies. The police eventually showed up, though it wasn't just one cruiser. Several vehicles arrived on the scene when the first officers realized how large the crowd was. By that time, the wedding ceremony had ended, and they were transitioning to the reception. The bride, Stanton's daughter, was in a white gown with a long train, and the groom, who I'd never met in my life, stood next to her looking somewhat bewildered. Their officiant had apparently already performed the vow exchange. The guests still had no idea that they were trespassing on private property. The music was turned up. The partying was in full swing, and the next thing you know, a handful of uniformed officers walked onto the property demanding to speak to whoever was in charge. That's when things got interesting. Stanton, smug as ever, tried to wave them off. According to Brock, who overheard some of the exchange, Stanton insisted this was all taken care of, and that he had full permission to be here. One of the officers asked for a signed document from the owner of the property, i.e. me, which Stanton, of course, did not have. I got a call from the lead officer on site. He asked me a series of questions to confirm my identity and ownership. Then he asked me to clarify that I had never given Stanton or anyone else permission to hold a wedding on my land. I answered that I had given absolutely no permission, that I'd never signed or even verbally agreed to such a thing, and that I wanted every trespasser removed from the premises immediately. From the bits and pieces I heard, once the lead officer relayed that to Stanton, the man started yelling about how this was a big misunderstanding, that the HOA has every right to use this farmland, and that I was in breach of community guidelines. It was laughable, except it was my property, so I was furious. The officers informed him that community guidelines do not override state laws on private property rights, and that if I did not give them express permission, they had to leave. For a moment, it seemed that perhaps Stanton might accept reality and lead his guests off the property. But then, in a bizarre twist, Stanton's wife, or partner, I never did get clarity on that, joined in. She started yelling at the officers, accusing them of ruining the bride's special day, and threatened to sue the department for harassment. That escalated the situation significantly. One officer tried to calm her down, but she reportedly shoved him away and continued ranting about how they'd spent thousands of dollars on this wedding. Another officer stepped in, but she refused to back off. At that point, people were pulling out their phones and recording everything. The bride, who had been standing on the sidelines, suddenly burst into tears. She apparently had no idea that her father had arranged the wedding on a stolen venue. The groom tried to console her, while some guests turned on Stanton, asking him how he could have arranged a wedding without the owner's knowledge or consent. Stanton, cornered, started screaming at the guests to calm down and told them everything was fine. Meanwhile, the officers were warning him and his wife that they needed to vacate the property. Then the conversation took a dramatic turn. One of the officers asked them to produce proof of permission in writing or to begin packing up. The wife lost her temper at that and allegedly took a swing at the officer, which resulted in immediate action by law enforcement. She was put in handcuffs right there on the lawn. It was a chaotic scene. Wedding guests screaming, the bride sobbing, the wedding planner or coordinator looking bewildered, and the caterers standing by their vans not knowing what to do. The police started instructing everyone to leave the property, telling them that if they didn't disperse, they risked charges of trespassing. Most guests scurried to their cars, but Stanton and a few of his close associates refused, saying they had rights as members of the HOA. That was nonsense, and the police recognized it as such. The final straw was when Stanton physically blocked one of the officers from walking toward the tent to ensure everyone inside was leaving. He put his hand up on the officer's chest, The officer warned him to stand down, but Stanton refused. The next thing you know, Stanton was forcibly arrested, his arms behind his back, still shouting about how this is private property that belongs to me through the HOA or some nonsensical claim. After the arrests, the wedding crowd dispersed in disarray. The bride and groom ended up fleeing in a flurry of tears, with some family members trailing behind them in a convoy of cars. The caterers hastily packed up their supplies and left, tossing food and plates into vans. The entire fiasco ended with my front yard strewn with chairs, half-empty glasses, and random floral arrangements. My gate was left wide open, and guests had left countless tire tracks in the grass. Some of my flower beds were trampled. The barn door was scratched up, though it didn't look like they managed to break in. In short, it was a complete mess. Brock and Darius sent me photos, and I felt my blood boil. The sense of violation was immense, but it didn't stop there. Because Stanton and his wife had been arrested, I soon found myself in discussions with the county prosecutor. They wanted to know if I intended to press charges for trespassing, property damage, or anything else. I absolutely did. I wasn't about to let these people walk all over me, especially after the brazen manner in which they'd used my farm as if it were their personal banquet hall. Moreover, it turns out that Stanton and his wife both had prior complaints against them for harassment of neighbors, though I don't believe they'd ever been formally prosecuted. This time, the evidence was overwhelming. Photos, videos, even statements from wedding guests who were willing to say on record that Stanton had told them he had permission from the farmer. Once it came out that it was all a fabrication, there was a tidal wave of condemnation from within the community. Some neighbors were outraged, others were mortified, and many like me were just furious. In the weeks that followed, I returned from my vacation to find my farm in shambles. I had to clean up the chairs, tables, and other decorations that people had left behind. Unfortunately, I couldn't do it alone, so I recruited Darius and Brock to help me gather and discard or donate some of the salvageable items. The archway they had installed by my porch was a nightmare to move. It had been staked into the ground with large metal rods. The entire fiasco took us the better part of a weekend to clear out. I made sure to document everything meticulously. I even had a notary friend come by to watch me record the damages, just so there would be no question about the authenticity of the evidence. As for Stanton and his wife, they faced criminal trespass charges, along with charges for assaulting a police officer. A neighbor later relayed to me that the municipal judge found both of them guilty. Stanton was handed a sentence that included short-term jail time and a considerable amount of community service, as well as restitution for damages to my property. His wife, who had shoved and allegedly taken a swing at one of the officers, ended up with a longer sentence. It wasn't years behind bars, but the judge made it clear that their behavior was unacceptable. The judge also took note of Stanton's attempts to impersonate me or to claim my land as the HOA's domain, which clearly added to the severity of his punishments. From what I heard, the entire ordeal was humiliating for them, which was a small measure of poetic justice for me. I harbor no joy in seeing people locked up, but let's just say I wasn't shedding any tears for their predicament. The day after Stanton's sentencing, the so-called board of the HOA issued a statement to the neighborhood disclaiming any responsibility for Stanton's actions. The statement said that Stanton had gone rogue and that they did not condone the unauthorized use of private property for any event. It was laughable because some of Stanton's closest confidants had apparently been a part of the wedding planning. I ended up ignoring the statement. Some neighbors said they believed the HOA was in damage control mode, trying to avoid legal liability. Meanwhile, a surprising number of people in the area approached me to apologize, even though they hadn't personally been involved. I think they were just embarrassed by the sheer magnitude of Stanton's scandal. The local gossip mill was on fire for months after that. Stories circulated about how Stanton's daughter refused to speak to him, and how the groom's family threatened to sue Stanton for emotional distress and for the cost of having to reschedule their wedding reception. The rumor was that the groom's parents ended up paying for a small ceremony elsewhere after the fiasco. They were outraged that their child's wedding day had become a spectacle. Some folks even speculated that the HOA was on the brink of collapse, as more residents realized how overbearing and potentially unlawful it had become in many respects. I noticed quite a few "for sale" signs popping up in the newer development that the HOA governed. Perhaps people wanted to distance themselves from the fiasco, or just escape the organization's toxic environment. In the meantime, I had my own battles to fight. The county required me to fill out a few forms documenting the incident, and I had to deal with my insurance to see if any of the damages could be covered. They typically don't cover something like an unauthorized wedding on your property, so it got a bit tricky. But at least I had official police reports stating that I was an unwilling victim of trespassing. The biggest hassle was reseeding the areas of my farmland that had turned into muddy parking lots that day. Tire ruts from cars had created deep grooves in my fields. I had to hire a local landscaping company to properly level and reseed. It took them a few days, and the final bill was substantial. Fortunately, the restitution I received from Stanton eventually covered most of that expense. That wasn't the end of my saga with the HOA, though. A few weeks later, I noticed I wasn't receiving any more of their letters about late fees or violations. In fact, the barrage of notices in my mailbox had gone eerily silent. One day, I ran into Brock and asked if he'd heard anything new. He said the HOA was in turmoil because a large portion of the board had resigned after Stanton's sentencing. They were apparently fearful that residents like me might pursue lawsuits against them for overstepping boundaries. Truthfully, I'd considered taking legal action, but once Stanton had been convicted and ordered to pay restitution, I felt I'd gotten enough closure. I just wanted to be left alone to manage my own farm. I wanted to restore it to its peaceful condition and carry on with my life. Despite the fiasco, I never regretted my decision to buy that farm. If anything, the experience reinforced my resolve to protect what was mine. No letter, no HOA threat, and certainly no unscrupulous boss was going to bully me off my land. The farm was the culmination of my dream, a symbol of freedom from the hectic city life I'd left behind. I had poured my heart and soul into renovating it, planting orchards, and caring for the small herd of cattle I'd acquired. I wasn't about to let anyone tear it down or claim it as their personal event space. In the aftermath, my relationship with Brock grew even stronger. He'd had my back from the start, warning me about Stanton and sticking up for me with the other neighbors. Darius, too, became an even closer friend. The two of them had been my eyes and ears while I was on vacation, and they played a crucial role in documenting the trespassing. Without them, I might have struggled to prove what happened by the time I got back. They continued to check in on me and helped me fix up some of the damage that the wedding guests had left behind. They even chipped in on hauling away the leftover decor. If there was any silver lining, it was discovering how supportive neighbors can be when something truly outrageous happens. Another unexpected outcome was how many local residents started contacting me with their own horror stories about the HOA. One older couple explained how they were threatened with fines for putting up a small greenhouse in their backyard. Another family was harassed over having an RV parked in their driveway. Even though they were well within county regulations, little by little, the facade of the HOA's authority began to crumble in people's minds. I think Stanton's downfall served as a catalyst for that. Without him at the helm, the organization lost its teeth. People realized that just because someone writes a letter on fancy letterhead doesn't mean you legally owe them anything. Still, I remained vigilant. For a while, I installed a couple of motion sensor cameras around my property, especially near the front gate and the barn. I wanted to make absolutely sure no one could sneak back in for any reason. Not that I expected another wedding fiasco, but once you've been burned, you can't help being cautious. The cameras gave me peace of mind, and they came in handy one night when a deer tripped one of the sensors. I also ended up posting a few more no trespassing signs and making sure my property boundaries were crystal clear to any passers-by. One subplot to this story was that in the months before the wedding debacle, I'd started a side business selling homemade jams and baked goods from the produce on my farm. I had a small roadside stand and occasionally set up a booth at the local farmers market. When word got out about the forced wedding fiasco, my small business unexpectedly boomed. People would come to my stand, buy some of my homemade berry preserves, and then strike up a conversation about what they'd seen or heard regarding the trespassing. It was the talk of the county for a long stretch. Many of these new customers became regulars. They sympathized with my ordeal and wanted to support a local farmer who had been wronged. While it wasn't how I'd have chosen to gain publicity, I can't deny that the extra traffic helped my finances. Every time someone asked me about the wedding, I tried to keep my tone light, even though it had been a stressful situation. "Well, I guess I can say my property was popular for a day," I'd joke, even if I wasn't around to enjoy it. That side business introduced me to more local residents who had their own interesting experiences with controlling or power-hungry HOAs. One day, A young couple came by for some strawberry rhubarb jam and confided that they had moved to a nearby rental property specifically because they'd been forced to give up a dog in their old HOA community. They empathized with me, saying it was only a matter of time before that type of overreach leads to bigger controversies. We had a good, long chat about property rights and how fundamental it is to protect them, especially in rural areas. It made me realize that so many people have their own stories of being hassled or bullied. My story might have been more dramatic. Who expects a wedding on their farmland without permission? But it tapped into that common frustration with overbearing associations. As time passed, I found more closure in the knowledge that Stanton and his wife had actually faced consequences, including jail time. They couldn't just wave their hands, claim HOA privilege, and skip away from accountability. The judge's sentence, while not overly long, sent a message that you can't trample on other people's property rights without repercussions, and their permanent record would now include convictions for trespassing and assaulting law enforcement. It was a serious blow to Stanton's reputation. Some folks said they moved out of the area entirely after they got out of jail, seeking a fresh start elsewhere. I almost felt a twinge of pity for Stanton's daughter, who was caught in the middle of her parents' foolish decisions. But any sympathy I had for Stanton or his wife vanished when I remembered the mess I had to clean up and the stress they caused. A final footnote to all of this is that my farm slowly returned to normal, though it took quite some time. The orchard is flourishing, the barn has been repaired, and the fences are in top shape. My routine is calmer now. I wake up early, feed the livestock, check on my crops, and then see to my jam and baked goods operation. Rita and I ended up taking a second vacation the following year, but this time I installed more robust security measures and made sure the local authorities had my updated contact information. We took a longer road trip to some different national parks. It was blissful, and I didn't receive a single distressing phone call from home while away. On a personal level, I grew from this experience. I learned not to automatically dismiss those early warnings from neighbors like Brock. I also learned that even though some people might dress up their demands in official-sounding language, it doesn't mean they have any legal right to bully or overstep. And most importantly, I learned the value of having good neighbors and friends who will step up when something seems amiss. It's easy to think you can handle everything on your own, but having people who can physically check on your property, snap pictures, and call you with updates is priceless, especially in a crisis. I'm grateful every day for the people who had my back. Friends, thank you. See you soon.